Today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, the Eucharist. What is it and what does it do? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Now, before we jump in, I want to say that this episode went a little long, to say the least. And so what was supposed to be a single episode on the Eucharist turned into two. So this is actually going to be part one of this episode, with part two resuming next week. So I know you're shocked. I never go long. I know my episodes never get broken up like that, but it did happen. It did. So with that, here we go. Let's jump into part one. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Those of you who are watching on YouTube, you'll notice my environment is a little bit different today, and that is because I am coming to you live from Lake Michigan. I'm currently traveling. I'm here at a cabin up in the UP. So today on the podcast, I actually had on the docket something else that was in the hopper. I was planning on doing something related to anthropology, mainly because if those of you who watched the last episode or listened to the last episode, you saw my interview with Adam Dell. And Adam and I had been working, as I mentioned in that episode, we had been working on a project specifically related to acceptance and commitment therapy, and my part had to do largely with talking about anthropology in the Eastern Church Fathers and whether or not that aligns with, where it echoes, where it diverges from ACT. And so that was a big part of our project, and for that reason, I had been doing a lot of writing and a lot of conversation with Adam, specifically about theological anthropology. And in those conversations, and you can actually, by the way, if you're interested in that topic in particular, you can go and visit my Substack where I published the contributions to his book. There's 3 letters there on anthropology, parts 1 through 3. So you can take a look at those, where I talk about the fall, I talk about the effects of the fall, I talk about the road to redemption that comes through Christ, and then repentance and faith and the sacraments and so on. And then I also talked about parallels and divergence from acceptance and commitment therapy in terms of what you see the Eastern Fathers prescribing in terms of the road back to healing and wholeness from the fall. So you can take a look at that. But for that reason, I had been thinking a lot about anthropology, and specifically about the ways in which anthropology, you can see, by the way, that guy back there, that's my brother. That's my brother, Kevin. He's sitting there in the back. So if you see him wandering in and out, this is his cabin. That's where I'm at. By the way, you can find it and you can rent it on, where can they find it? VVRO. What is it? Yes, and so if you like the looks of this place and you want to have a little getaway on Lake Michigan, you can actually go ahead and find my brother's cabin on VBRO. What would they search for?
Cedar Cabin on the Bay.
Search for Cedar Cabin on the Bay. Look at this. We're plugging and endorsing things here on the podcast. This episode brought to you courtesy of Cedar on the Bay cabin. So anthropology, it had been on my mind quite a bit because of that project. And there's certain things that I've touched on in different episodes that I thought, oh, this would be a good opportunity to talk about those. And some of that had to do with just the ways in which ancient anthropology contrasts with some of the contemporary anthropologies that you see, whether you're talking about in the scientific community, where there's a certain materialism and determinism that tends to be basically the default setting there, or other types of anthropology that are sometimes tacitly presumed within, like, counseling psychology or therapy or things like that, which is part of what I had been talking to Dr. Dell about. But I received a request. I received a request that derailed that episode plan, which was specifically related to the Eucharist. And let me just give an aside here. We do look at the comments, right? If there are specific topics you're wanting me to weigh in on, go ahead and jump in there on the topic, in the comments, and tell us what you're interested in. We do pay attention to those. I can't guarantee that I'm going to do it just because you request it, but we do look at it. We do take it into account. I have a number of things in the queue that I want to talk about, like anthropology, like ethics, and some other topics. But since I received a request specifically to talk about the Eucharist, and that interested me. I was like, sure, why not? Let's go ahead and do that. That's going to be today's episode. And so specifically, I'm going to be looking at some of the history of, how the Eucharist was understood, some of the metaphysical discussions about that and how that evolves over time. And then also shed some light on the view that you find in the Eastern Church Fathers, which is one of the least understood and least known aspects of the history of that topic. And then with that, there's an aspect of this question that I'm going to hold. Till the very end. But this is a question of, it was sort of asked, well, like, what does it do? And specifically, not only what does it do, if it's supposed to produce saints, why don't we see more saints? Is it not supposed to produce saints? What's going on with that in terms of the effects, right? And so I want to look at some of those questions there toward the end. But I want to start by actually talking about some of the general history regarding the Eucharist and some of the disputes that you see around that, specifically in the West, and then bring into the discussion, toward the latter part of the episode, where the East sits on a lot of these sorts of topics. So with that, let's jump on in. Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Jacobs, scholar in residence at Vanderbilt and host of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, and I'm inviting you to join my Introduction to Philosophy class starting August 7th, with lectures every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central. You get 22 hours of live, interactive lectures with me over the course of 13 weeks as we survey the history of ideas from ancient to modern philosophy. Can't make it live? No problem. It's all recorded, and everyone registered for the class will have access to those recordings. You can audit the class and simply enjoy the lectures and interactions, or take it for credit. Transcripts will be available showing the class is accredited should you want to transfer to a college of your choosing. Register by August 4th. To sign up, visit myproffer.com today. See description for details. And a quick note about Proffer. Higher education is broken, and Proffer is working hard to fix it. You'll be hearing a lot about this company in the coming years. It's a tech startup aimed at revolutionizing higher ed through decentralized, independent learning. Why do I trust them? Because I'm the CEO. Our mission is to make accredited college courses available from the best educators in the world at a fraction of the cost, with maximal flexibility for both educators and students. Our website may look a little rough around the edges during this beta phase, but the education is world-class. We're bringing in professors from Notre Dame, Stanford, Northern Arizona University, and more just for our beta test. Their courses go live in the coming weeks, but don't be surprised if, at the moment, you see only me and my course on the site. So be amongst the first to join the revolution in higher ed by going to myproffer.com and signing up for my class today. Now, back to the show. So when it comes to the topic of the Eucharist and some of the historical disputes about this particular point of theology, there's a general history that I think probably floats around. Then some of the basic points that those who have any exposure to theology are probably familiar with. Typically, I think what folks' general impressions are is that, well, in the early church, you don't really have a metaphysical explanation of what the Eucharist is, but you do have a commitment to the idea that somehow the Eucharist, communion, if you're familiar with that term instead, is the body and blood of Christ. That the early church was committed to that. They seem to be pretty clearly sort of on board with it really is the body and blood of Christ, but they don't offer a metaphysical explanation for how that works or why that is. They just believe it's so because Scripture promises that it is so, right? That if we do these things, that this is what we have access to, the body and blood of Christ. And then within that, right, then you reach these medieval discussions where there's an attempt to put a metaphysical sort of explanation, as it were, to this commitment. And you have really three views that start to emerge. I think most people have heard of transubstantiation, which is the official Catholic view, which is that somehow the bread and wine cease to be bread and wine, and the nature of those things, the form of those things, are pulled out, and it's replaced with body and blood. And so even though it appears to be bread and wine, it really is the body and blood of Christ, transubstantiation, that being the substance change, right? Transubstantiation. That's what the term means. And then some people who perhaps have a little bit more exposure to theology maybe have heard the term consubstantiation, which is the view that it's not that bread and wine are removed, substantially removed from it, but instead you have the addition of body and blood, the body and blood of Christ. And so it's both, right? And that becomes the view that most people have heard there if they've heard that sort of explanation of consubstantiation. And then perhaps some have heard the term real presence, right? Which is basically a commitment that says, look, we're not going to give a metaphysical explanation for how the mechanics of this work, but we are going to say that somehow, right? Somehow, mystically, Christ is present in this, and so we're going to say that he really is there. Hence, real presence. Now, I don't know if everybody realizes that those are three medieval views, but they are, right? And so some people, perhaps they've heard consubstantiation or real presence in the context of, Lutheranism or something like that. But all three of those positions emerge in the medieval era. And so then within that medieval era, you don't actually have a committed Roman Catholic position. You just have several options, on loan, so to speak, that people could subscribe to, but you don't have an official position of the church in terms of what actually is happening here in terms of the Eucharist. And then after the Reformation, obviously, this becomes a discussion point, a point of dispute. And again, I think running with the general narrative that most people have exposure to, there's an understanding that what you have is the Roman Catholic Church commits to transubstantiation, that the Lutherans, and this is where things get a little murky, I've heard a lot of people suggest that they think the Lutherans hold to consubstantiation. That's actually a common misunderstanding. The Lutherans officially hold to real presence. And then you have these other sort of symbolic or memorial views. And so this is typically traced as Zwingli, right, where you have the idea that somehow the Eucharist is just a memorial, it's symbolic, representative of Christ's body and blood and remembering his death. But it's not actually, there's nothing substantially changing there. It really is just sort of symbolic. And then where the sort of Reform view falls, I think, is a bit of a mystery for a lot of people. And the reason is because on the one hand, you have this rejection of, if you know the historical literature, bread worship, right, which is what they sort of accused the Roman Catholics of. And so they don't like too strong of a, this is anything that moves too close to something like transubstantiation, where Christ is really there, and that would, justify venerating or, holding vigil or sort of, giving any sort of reverence to the elements themselves. And yet, what you find within the Reformed is this sort of view that does seem to be elevated, that this actually does seem to have an effect. But the difference is, rather than Christ coming down to be in the elements, the believer, by partaking of these things, is lifted up to commune with Christ in the heavenlies, so to speak. So there is a spiritual effect, but it's not a presence of Christ within these elements in some way. So that's the basic narrative. I think folks who have some amount of exposure to theology, that's sort of the basic narrative that they have in terms of church history and developments regarding the Eucharist. Now, there's certain aspects of this narrative that are true and certain ones that are false. One of the main falsehoods that I find most important is that there are no metaphysical commitments whatsoever in terms of the early church fathers. That's actually not true. Now, that's one of the things that I actually want to focus on and talk about, because I think it's really an important point with regard to understanding this entire history and this topic and so on. But the way I want to back into that is actually not starting with the church fathers themselves. I want to start with a more obscure discussion that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with, that occurs in the post-Reformation era. So in the post-Reformation era, what you have is this one dispute starts to happen where the Lutherans begin to pay attention to certain things being said in the New Testament that seem to ascribe, in some ways, divine attributes to Christ's humanity. And specifically, this is relevant to the Eucharist itself. And they start to wonder, like, in order to actually affirm these things that are being said in Scripture, do we have to say that in some ways there's some sort of communication or mingling between Christ's divinity and his humanity? And their answer is actually yes. They end up concluding that the divine attributes must have been in some measure communicated to Christ's humanity. Now, this becomes alarming to the Reformed in particular. Reformed and Lutheran often disagreed about the Eucharist, and you can see this. You can see this in various polemics, right? Where, the Lutherans, the Reformed want to say, polemically that a body can only have, be present in one location, and this is one of their polemics against that, against the Lutheran position that suggests that somehow Christ is present in the Eucharist in various places, and the Lutherans come back and they basically say, oh, well, the difference between the Lutherans and the Reformed is that we believe the Bible and you don't. And so there's definitely tensions between the Lutheran and the Reformed on the Eucharist as a particular point of theology. But this is one of the places where this becomes really quite heated, because the Lutherans have said, okay, we think Scripture and the things said in Scripture about Christ's body and his blood and the rest, it actually seems to require that there's some communication of divine attributes to his humanity. Now, the Lutherans, backing up. Now, the Reformed end up responding to this, and they say, well, if you're going to suggest that there's a mingling of attributes between his divinity and his humanity, well, we have a name for that. It's called monophysitism, and it's a heresy. It's a heresy that's specifically condemned at Chalcedon. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term Chalcedon, there's 7 ecumenical councils that end up hashing out and defining the Orthodox understanding of the Trinity and of Christology. And Chalcedon is the 4th council in this sort of progression where that's being defined. And part of Chalcedon was actually refuting the idea of, well, Eutychianism and then also monophysitism. And these notions were the notions that somehow the divinity and the humanity of Christ are somehow intermingled and confused, right? So the standard formulation of Christology, if you're talking about the Chalcedonian formulation of it, is that Christ is fully God, right? He is of the same nature as his Father. He chooses to become fully human, so he shares in our nature. Everything that we have, he also has. And then those two natures are united in one person, right? So there's only one guy here, right? The same guy who is with the Father also becomes incarnate and is the Son of Mary. And then also those natures are unmingled, right? Or they are not confused, without confusion or mingling. And that is where basically, they're trying to resist the idea that somehow he ceases to be divine or ceases to be human. The rationale, of course, is that if you take something like a centaur, you don't have a human and a horse. You have some sort of compromise mingling of horse and human that gets you something new, right? A centaur, where it has some elements of equine nature, it has some elements of human nature, but they've been mingled and compromised and confused to produce something new, right? Something that is neither, horse nor human. And the worry is that this is one of the ways of dealing with the incarnation, is that certain positions end up suggesting that there's a mingling or a confusion of natures where Christ really isn't God anymore. He really isn't man. He's sort of a demigod, which is a weird sort of mingling of half God, half man. And that was rejected, right? The idea being that the incarnation is actually that both his divinity is fully preserved, our humanity is fully preserved, and these are had in one person without confusion or mingling. And so when the Reformed hear that the Lutherans want to suggest that somehow, the divine attributes have been communicated to the human nature of Christ, right? That somehow some aspect of divinity has been communicated to his humanity, they say, well, that certainly sounds like monophysitism, right? It certainly sounds like some sort of confusion or mingling has taken place. And so they said, well, basically, you are monophysitists, right? In this dispute we're having about the Eucharist, which is the primary thing that was motivating the Lutherans. In this dispute, you've slipped into the heresy of monophysitism, where you're suggesting that the natures mingle. And we've already solved that, right? The ecumenical councils already solved that problem. They're not mingled. Well, the Lutherans came back and they said, well, there's also a name for what you're saying, where they don't mingle. And that's called Nestorianism. And here, the Lutherans actually were looking at Cyril of Alexandria. And one of the things that happens in this dispute between Cyril of Alexandria and the heretic Nestorius, which precedes Chalcedon, it actually precedes, it's what leads to the Third Ecumenical Council, Ephesus, is that the heretic Nestorius had advocated that there are actually two persons, right? So, as I said, in the formulation, Christ is fully God, he's fully man, and those two natures are united in one person. That's Cyril's position. But Nestorius had said, like, I think what you have is you have divinity with a person, you have humanity with a person, and somehow these two persons are joined together. And that's what we call Christ, which is this union of two persons. And Cyril had, argued against that, saying, look, that's not how Scripture ever speaks. It always speaks about the Logos who is with the Father, that person, becoming incarnate, same person. So this is what's sometimes called Cyril's like single person exegesis, meaning when you read the Bible, you see only one person talked about when talking about Christ. And so he suggests that Nestorius is all wrong. And that was a big feature of the Council of Ephesus. But one of the things that's also a lesser known feature of that dispute is that Nestorius also thought the persons are insulated from each other. In other words, he believed that the divine energies, right, the energies are operative powers, which we'll talk, if you're unfamiliar with that term, if you listen to me a lot, you've heard that term a lot. If you're unfamiliar with this podcast and you're unfamiliar with me, you might be unfamiliar with that term. But don't worry, hang with us. We'll get back to it. But the idea being that Nestorius had suggested that the energies or the operative powers of the divine nature sort of remain with the divine nature, and so with the human nature, and there is no mingling of those sorts of things. And Cyril actually said, like, no, that's not true. Like, there's only one person. There are two natures. They're unconfused. That's true, right? There's no compromise of either nature. But the divine nature does communicate its energies or its operative powers over to human nature. And there's a very good reason why Cyril advocated for that. But again, we're going to hold that for now. But the point is that the Lutherans were reading Cyril, and they're like, look, Cyril of Alexandria, the entire Ephesus dispute, this actually does look like he's saying that there is some sort of attribute of divinity being communicated to his humanity. And so you, Reformed people, you are actually advocating for Nestorianism. Your position is the Nestorian position that was condemned. And so what I find so fascinating about this sort of lesser-known dispute in the post-Reformation era is that both of them are correct. And that actually is the case. The Lutheran view, because of certain deficiencies in their knowledge of things like the essence energies distinction, actually is rightly accused by the Reformed of being a form of monophysitism. The way they're formulating it, it is susceptible to that criticism. Now, the Reform view, by contrast, rightly calling that out and saying that there is no communication, the Lutherans are quite right to say, well, if there's no communication of attributes between the two, then we have a form of Nestorianism, which is also heretical. And the answer is they're both correct. And neither position represents the position that you find in the early church fathers, the position that's represented in the ecumenical councils, the position that's represented of Cyril of Alexandria, and ultimately the Orthodox position, right? The Eastern Orthodox position of the view. And so what I think is so interesting about this discussion is actually highlights a certain deficit, a theological deficit that begins to emerge in the Western discussion, specifically because they lost the essence energies distinction. So that's why I think that's a great little setup. So let's talk about this topic of divine attributes and how the East and the West differ when it comes to understanding divine attributes, because that's really the key to understanding what's going on in this discussion. So within the Western discussion of attributes, typically what this term means is this is sort of a metaphysical term for essentially what you would call the difference between the essential and the accidental properties of a thing. And when you're talking about the attributes of a thing, you're typically talking about the essential properties, the properties that make that thing what it is. So, for example, I always use these sorts of examples like a square, right? So a square, you've got four sides, you've got four right angles, all the sides are equal length, right? They run parallel, the two sides on the one side, the top and bottom. those sorts of things, right? You could sit there and you could name what the essential properties of a square are. If you don't have these things, you don't have a square. And if you do have all of these, then you do have a square, right? So if we're going to have a square, we need those essential properties, right? They are indisposable to it being a square. Now, the contrast, of course, is accidental properties. And this is where you're talking about properties that, could or could not be part of a square, that are subject to change without changing the fact that it's a square. And so these are things like color, right? When we draw a square, we might draw it, red, blue, green, and all of that's accidental. It has no bearing on whether or not it's a square. Size, right? It could be 1 foot, it could be 100 feet, right? But that in itself has no bearing on whether or not it's square, right? It can be very small, very big. Location, right? Whether it's here or there has no bearing on whether or not it's a square. So that's what's called an accidental property. And so typically when you're talking about the attributes of a thing, you're talking about these sort of essential properties, right? The properties that are essential to what it is, right? To its nature, to its form, right? And so here, for those, again, who listen to me regularly, you're familiar with the concept of realism, right? The idea that there actually are sort of properties that are out there that are part of the world, right? So the realist nominalist divide that I oftentimes talk about is the question about when we look out into the world and we see all of these sort of different categories, right? Genera and species. We see common properties like bipedal, or we see a common species like dog or equine. The question is, are those just inventions of the mind that we're imposing on the world? If you say that, you're a nominalist. Or is the mind somehow abstracting and discerning real, right, properties that are out there in the world? And the realist says those are real properties. And those real properties are typically, in classical philosophy, they're referred to as forms. And so this is where somebody like Aristotle, which is particularly relevant, is going to be particularly relevant to a lot of the medieval discussions that we're going to talk about here, will draw a distinction between the formal properties, the nature or essence of the thing, and the material, right? So he has 4 causes. Aristotle has 4 causes. He talks about the formal, which is what it is, the material of what it's made, the efficient cause, how it comes to be, and the final cause, why or for what end. This is, if you're unfamiliar with those terms, don't be worried. It's very straightforward and basic, right? So if we had a wooden chair in front of us, we'd say, well, what is it, right? Well, it's a chair. That's the formal cause, the form, what it is, right? If you said, okay, well, what's it made of, right? Well, you'd say it's wood, right? Hence wooden chair, right? Okay, so that's the material cause of what it's made. How did it come about, right? Okay, well, somebody built it, right? There's this guy, Bob, down the road. He makes chairs, great chairs, the best chairs they've ever been. They're huge, right? There it is, right? Bob is our efficient cause of this chair coming about. And then, well, why? For what end does this chair exist? And the answer is to be sat on, right? Okay, so that's your final cause. So that's what it is: formal, material, efficient, and final. What it is, of what it's made, how it came about, why or for what end. And so when the realist is talking about the nature of a thing, they're referring specifically to the formal cause. Like, what is the species of thing? So you and I are human, right? Lassie over there is dog, right? Seabiscuit over there is equine, right? Trees, you can do all the same sort of thing. So when you're talking about what it is, you're talking about the formal cause, the form, the nature or essence of a thing. Like I said, this is going to be relevant when we get to the Eucharist stuff and we start talking about theories like transubstantiation, consubstantiation. So in that context, usually when you're talking about attributes, you're talking about the essential properties of a certain nature. So this is why when I said, for example, a square having 4 sides, having right angles, those are its attributes, right? The attributes of a square. If you're talking about a human, things like bipedal, 10-fingered, 2-eyed, rational, those sorts of things, that's where you're talking about the attributes of human. So now when you're talking about divine attributes, typically in the Latin West, the divine attributes refer to the essential properties of the divine nature, right? So the idea being that there is a divine nature, right? God is a certain type of thing, just like you and I are a certain type of thing. You and I are human, God is divine or God, right? And so just like the fact that we have certain essential properties or attributes, like bipedal or two-eyed, so God has certain essential properties, right? Certain attributes. And within classical sort of monotheistic Latin Western views, the divine attributes are typically associated with the various omnis. If you've heard that God is omnibenevolent, right? He is all good, right? Or that he's omniscient, that he's all knowing. These are the sort of standard divine attributes. And so one of the challenges you run into, of course, is that what the Lutherans seem to be saying when they're talking about that divine attributes are somehow communicated to Christ's humanity. This is why the Reformed rightly pause and they say, wait a second, that sounds like monophysitism, right? So let's go back for a minute to the type of analogy I use very quickly to explain what monophysitism is, right? If you have a horse, we can sit here and we can talk about it having, 4 legs, right? That it's a quadruped, animal and so on. And then we can talk about the attributes of man, that it's bipedal. And then what we look at is that we say, well, wait a second, certain attributes of a man are actually removed, of human nature, are actually removed and replaced when combined with equine nature. So what we see is a centaur is not actually bipedal, it's quadruped, which a human is not. Well, and then it also has all these other sort of attributes that a horse have, but at the same time, it's mingled or mixed together with a bunch of attributes with man, like that we're rational, and then we have this other type of fleshly nature that we have, that we have 2 arms, that we have 10 fingers, all that sort of stuff. And so when you're looking at a centaur, what you're seeing is a sort of a mixing and matching of attributes, where certain attributes are brought in from the equine nature, certain attributes are brought in from the human nature, certain attributes of human nature are actually stripped out, certain attributes of horse nature are stripped out, and then they're sort of combined in a way that gets you something new, right? Something that is neither horse nor human, but has certain attributes of both. And that's the worry, right? That when you're talking about Christology, this is one of the Christological heresies. That if you look at all the various Christological heresies, oftentimes they were ways of trying to somehow solve the merger of divinity and humanity in the person of Christ. And oftentimes what they would do is they would somehow either compromise his divinity or compromise his humanity or compromise his personhood, right? That's typically what happens. So if you look at the history of the different Christological heresies, some of the early ones, right, are things like Apollinarianism. Apollinaris was a brilliant, sort of early Christian mind that people had great admiration for, but sort of this devastating fact that Apollinaris went off the rails and he espoused this Christological heresy. And his way of, sort of trying to solve the incarnation problem, if you want to call it a problem, was to say, well, what man is a tripartite being, right? He has a body, an animal body, he has an animal soul, and then he has a spirit, right? This rational mind. And when we look at God, well, what is God, right? God is a spirit, right? A rational, being, an intelligent nature. And so if what we do is we say that, well, what Christ did is he took a human body, a fleshly body, he took a human soul, and then he became the rational spirit. Now we've got a human, right? Because we got a body, soul, and a spirit. And then but we've also got, divinity, right? So, because we've got the Logos, which is a rational spirit that occupies that spot. And that was one of the things that was rejected, because part of the thing you find in, like Gregory of Nazianzus in one of his letters, for example, he actually says, well, look, part of the entire point of what Christ is doing is he's taking on human nature in order to heal it, right? So he's taking it on, he's reunited it with the immortal life of God, and he's defeating death and healing it and restoring it and elevating it. And if there's some part of it that he doesn't take on, then that part isn't healed, right? Or put more concisely, whatever is not appropriated is not healed, which is what Gregory says in his letter. And so he says, look, surely the human mind or the spirit is one of the things that needs to be healed. And so Apollinaris, this is heretical. And also one of the things Gregory pointed out is he said, and the others who opposed Apollinaris pointed out, is you don't actually have a human, because a human isn't just that we have a generic body. It's that we have a human body. It's not just that we have a generic soul. It's that we have a human soul. And it's not just that we have a generic spirit. We have a human spirit, right? So whatever you've got, it's more like a centaur, right, where there's some part of the nature that's been ripped out and replaced with a different nature, that is not actually an incarnation, right? This is the positing of a third type of thing that is neither divine nor human. It is some sort of hybrid. And so that was rejected. And so monophysitism was, again, one of these sorts of heresies where what it was seen as is there's some sort of compromise with regard to the two natures. So here the context is the worry, and this is something that oftentimes happens, right, is that there's a certain overcorrection that happens with a certain heretic, and the position of the councils and of the fathers is to come back and be like, no, 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 no. Like, I realize that you're opposed to this view over here, and you're right to be opposed to that, but you've overcorrected. There's these pendulum swings that happen. And so this is so it is with monophysitism. So with Nestorius, as I had mentioned, Nestorius is someone who had this sort of peculiar view that Christ is two persons that are somehow united. And Nestorius got here basically because, on the one hand, he is what's called a moderate realist, which most of the Eastern Fathers have some form of what might be labeled moderate realism. The idea being that natures are pure abstractions unless sort of made concrete and real within a subject, right? So you never look around and say, hey, oh, look at that, right? There's the form of man floating about there, the archetypal form of man. What you always encounter is a concrete particular man, right? So it's always instantiated. When it's instantiated, now it's concrete. But aside from that, it's a mere abstraction, right? That, according to Basil of Caesarea, has no stasis, right? Has no stability. And that's why it needs a hypostasis, an individual or a subject who has it that makes it concrete and stable and real, right? So Nestorius recognized this, right? He held that the natures are pure abstractions unless sort of, made concretely real. And so every nature that is somehow concretely real has a person. That was Nestorius's position. But for some reason, Nestorius started to suggest, well, if that's the case, then if you're really going to merge two natures, and you're not going to have them be confused, you're going to need to have two persons, right? One that makes one nature concrete and one that makes the other nature concrete. And then those two natures of those two persons have to be somehow fused together. And that was Nestorius' position, that fusing ends up becoming what he uses the term Christ. And incidentally, just in case people are unfamiliar with this discussion, this is part of the reason why you'll hear Orthodox Christians regularly refer to the Virgin Mary as the Theotokos, right? The God birther, or the mother of God, or literally God birther, but mother of God, right? And the reason they stick with that and they utilize that terminology is because that was the boogeyman for Nestorius, right? Nestorius refused to use the term Theotokos, God birther, because he was like, no, 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 she only births that other guy, right? In terms of the two persons. And so he was okay actually with, well, technically what he says is she births the merger of the two guys was his position. So he rejected on the one hand Theotokos, God birther. He rejected Anthropotokos, right, which would be, man birther, and instead wanted Christotokos because Christ was the term he used for this merger of two guys. And so ultimately, he was like, she's Christotokos, not Theotokos. So this is one of the reasons why, Theotokos was such a big point of dispute, because what Cyril's point is he's saying, well, the question is not what does Mary birth? The question is who does Mary birth? And the who is the second person of the Trinity, right? And so this was actually one of the ways of sort of making sure, right, this being a resistance to any sort of Nestorian view that would suggest that Christ is somehow two persons, right? And this is actually, okay, so in the Third Ecumenical Council, this is one of the things that ends up being decided. Yes, Christ is one person, Mary is the Theotokos. Incidentally, just as a little bit of an aside here, I do think this is one of the reasons why, if you really do understand the 7 ecumenical councils of the first millennium, right, then if you understand them correctly, what you see is they really are all about Christ. So whether they're talking about Mary, like whether she's Theotokos, or they're talking about icons, like in the 7th ecumenical council, the real question is about Christology, right? They're dealing with those things because they think they have a ramification on how you see the person of Christ. So is it John Baer who had sort of popularized the notion that that every one of the ecumenical councils is answering the same question: "Who do you say that I am?" Right. Anyway, so just an aside over there. So that's the point of the Council of Ephesus. But this sets the stage. This is where I was talking about pendulum swings. This sets the stage for the monophysite dispute, which gives rise to Chalcedon, right? So in terms of the monophysites, there is sort of an advocacy of what is at least perceived to be a form of monophysitism in the wake of the Council of Ephesus, because of the vehement, sort of resistance to the Nestorians. And this is what gives rise and occasions Chalcedon, where the point of Chalcedon had to say, like, look, yes, it's true that, Christ is divine. That was the first ecumenical council, contra Arius. It's also true that he's fully human. Everything that we have, he has. That's part of the second ecumenical council, which is also giving you the three persons, but that's also the part where they're opposing Apollinaris. And so it's like, yeah, like he really does everything that we have, he has, right? Including a human mind, right? It's a spirit, right? And then with Ephesus, and he's only one person, right? But now the worry is, some people are so concerned with the one person having the two natures that they might be advocating some sort of mingling or confusion. And that's where Chalcedon is wanting to hold all of this together and say, look, fully God, fully man, both of those natures had unconfused, right, in one person. And this is what gives rise to the non-Chalcedonian churches, right? So factions that wanted to say we don't advocate for Chalcedon. Now, what's interesting is the worry in those non-Chalcedonian churches was largely that they feared that Chalcedon gave too much to the Nestorians, right? And so the way this is sometimes portrayed, at least, is that the non-Chalcedonian churches were monophysites, right? And Chalcedon was opposed to monophysitism. Now, there is some dispute over whether or not that's a right reading of those non-Chalcedonian churches, whether or not some of them who have been accused of being monophysites are in fact monophysites. And I tend to be of the mind that they really are sort of advocating for Cyrilline language and views, and that their main fear is the boogeyman of Nestorius, and they do fear that the Tome of Leo, which is advocated in the Council of Chalcedon, is a little too Nestorian for their liking. I understand that, but I think the Council of Chalcedon was very clearly making sure that you read the Tome of Leo in a Cyrilline way, and this comes through in certain things where they use the language about that Christ's two natures recognized in one person. That language specifically comes out of Cyril, and they're trying to make sure that everybody knows, right? We are siding with Cyril. We're not overturning Cyril. This should never be accepted in a Nestorian way. But nonetheless, that's what occasions that sort of rift that happens in the wake of Chalcedon. Now, my point in all this is not actually to go down the sort of rabbit hole of the ecumenical councils or anything like that. My point is to actually to talk about basically what you're talking about. When we talk about monophysitism and we're talking about the worry of monophysitism, what is it that we're really talking about? Because that's the worry that's sitting there in the sort of Lutheran and Reformed dispute about the Eucharist, right? So returning to that dispute, the Lutherans are sitting here looking at Cyril and saying he is talking about some sort of communication of divine attributes to humanity. Okay, now we'll talk about exactly how that's working in Cyril, but that's what they're seeing, and they're saying, so I think there is legitimacy here, not just in the biblical text for some sort of communication of attributes, but also just precedent in terms of the church fathers. We're looking at Cyril of Alexandria, right? Clearly there must be something there. But of course, the Reformed are looking at this and saying, like, look, if you're talking about some sort of communication of attributes, it sounds like you're getting dangerously close to monophysitism, where there's some sort of attributes of divinity that end up being transferred over to his humanity. And now we have some sort of confused thing, which is the whole thing that Chalcedon is trying to avoid, right? So that's the sort of context for the type of dispute that's going on here. So with that as the backdrop, part of the question we face is, well, the Lutherans are correct that they're seeing something in Cyril about a communication of attributes. So what is it that they're seeing? How is it that Cyril can talk about a communication of attributes without advocating for monophysitism? I think the real answer to this question begins when we start to recognize that what is meant by the word attribute in the Eastern Church Fathers is very different than what's meant by attribute in typical Western sort of monotheistic scholastic type discussions. So as I had mentioned, when I talked about attributes in the Latin Western context, attributes refer to the essential property of a nature. And this is actually then what gives rise to a certain form of what's called divine simplicity in the Latin West, which is to say that God is simple. He doesn't have parts. And within this context, what you see in people like, Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas and others, what you see is a certain view of simplicity that begins to say, well, if God is really sort of simple, right, he is some sort of singular unity that doesn't have parts, right? He's not a composite in any way. He's not a species within a broader genus. He doesn't have that sort of multiplicity that you find in the created realm, right? There is some sort of singularity about God. Then how can we talk about multiple divine attributes? Because that would seem to indicate multiple properties, and that would suddenly make him complex and not simple. And the typical Western Latin solution to this was actually to suggest that in some ways, all of the attributes are the same attribute. This is the sort of thing, like I said, in Anselmian simplicity, where he wants to suggest that somehow divine justice, like God is, like, it's not just that part of him is justice. He is all justice, right? And it's not just that part of him is power, but he's all power. It's not just that part of him is knowing, but he's all knowing. And this goes to some of his perfect being theology, suggesting that if he were only partly this, then there could be a greater conceivable being and so on. So you can find this sort of thing like in the context where he's talking about his ontological argument, for example. But this becomes pretty standard in the Latin West. And so the conclusion becomes that really, justice and power and omniscience, the various omnis, these are really just sort of different perspectives on the same thing, right? These are all just sort of naming the same common divine nature. And if we could sort of see them properly, what we'd realize is that they're all the same thing, which is the divine essence itself. And you end up with this super simple essence in which all of those attributes are just the divine essence itself. So that becomes a pretty standard Latin position, or a very, very clearly sort of mainline Latin position within the medieval scholastics. But this is very different than what you find in the Eastern Church Fathers. So when you look at the Eastern Church Fathers and you find them talking about simplicity, you find immediate differences between what they're saying about divine simplicity and what the Latin West is saying about divine simplicity. So when you look at the Eastern Fathers on simplicity, you find a couple of things. First of all, when they talk about divine simplicity, they are very clearly talking about the divine nature itself. So you see this in like Gregory of Nyssa's Contra Eunomius, right? Where he's just saying like, yeah, the divine nature is simple, meaning whatever God is, like, he's that and only that, and he's not a mixture of different, species of things, or, he's not a species within a broader genus or something like that. So the divine nature, this infinite, boundless nature, is one. But then Gregory will go ahead and say, but, the persons are several. And what you also see in people like Basil of Caesarea is they say, and the energies or the operative powers that exude from that nature are innumerable. And actually what you can see is in, some of Basil's writings, for example, I forget which letter it is, like letter 234, I think, where he's just like, look, it would be silly to suggest that all of the attributes are the same, right? That his wrath and his mercy are the same thing or something like that. So this is very different than what you find in the Latin West. But in order to see that difference, what you have to see is that they recognize that the divine attributes are actually the divine energies. And so they draw a distinction between the divine nature and the divine energies. And the energies are what they mean by divine attributes. They are not essential properties of the divine essence. So it's a very different view. Okay, so what is meant by the term energies? Now, you can go and see my episode with David Bradshaw, who is one of the foremost authorities on this topic, right, on the sort of historical development of the term, energia, from which, which we're here translating into English as energies. But so you could look at that episode for a very long sort of treatment of that. But the sort of short version of it is that essentially what you find is that very early on, in somebody like Aristotle, there's this distinction drawn between the nature of thing and the operative powers or the operations or the energies that express that nature. So, for example, the nature of mind, right, is one thing, this rational or intelligent nature. But that mind can express itself in various operations, right? It can use language. It can express itself through doing mathematics or computational sort of stuff, logic, those sorts of things. It can express itself in various creative ways or in imaginative ways or whatever. And these are all distinct expressions or operative powers or energies, right, of the divine mind. And so you get that basic logical distinction between what a thing is, right? The formal cause, the nature of the thing, and the various ways in which that form expresses itself actively, right? And as that concept develops, that gets picked up in Alexandrian Judaism and people like Philo of Alexandria and in some other places as well. Again, see David Bradshaw's book, Aristotle, East and West, if you want to follow the full development of this into like Judaism and then, also Neoplatonism and Christianity. It's an excellent book. So this gets picked up in Alexandrian Judaism and then in the New Testament and then in the Eastern Church Fathers. And one of the developments that happens beyond Aristotle is this notion of communicability. And so there's a recognition that there are certain attributes of certain natures that can be communicated from one type of thing to another. So the classic example that's oftentimes always, sort of given by the Eastern Church Fathers when talking about this is the fire and metal analogy. So they would talk about, well, sort of the formal cause, a fire of the pyratic nature is one thing, but how that pyratic nature actively expresses itself is through various operations of heating and of lighting, right? Those are sort of the obvious points at which the nature expresses itself. And yet then we can take this other nature of iron, and iron, we can put it in fire and it can be heated to the point that at some point the iron itself begins to glow and to burn. And we can take it out and we could burn other things with it, or we could illuminate a dark space with it, or whatever it might be. We could light other things on fire. And so what you start to see is you see that even though the iron is still iron, something of this other nature has taken up residence within it. The operative powers of fire are now resident within the iron. There has been some sort of communication that's taken place, some sort of communion between the two that has taken place. And so that was sort of an additional sort of development with regard to this concept originally in like Alexandrian Judaism and then in the New Testament. And the importance of this concept that there are certain types of natures that are receptive to foreign energies was critical because what they saw is they saw this trend within, spiritual realities. So obviously, when you look at demoniacs, right, what you see is, here is a human person, and that human person seems to display certain, let's call them attributes, that are foreign to their nature. They seem to have secret knowledge that they didn't know, right? They speak a language that they didn't know, or they know dark secrets about a person that they really shouldn't know. And they didn't acquire those things by the typical sort of form of human investigation. So this seems to be coming from someplace else. They seem to show certain types of powers that, seem to be alien to their nature, right? Like superhuman strength or something like that. Now, the way in which a lot of contemporary people tend to think about those sorts of things is they think about it in a mechanical way because they have a very sort of mechanical and insulated view of substances. This is largely due to the influence of the Enlightenment and the mechanical philosophy. But so they might think of it, well, the demon must be whispering in their ears certain secrets. It must be that the demon is sort of reinforcing their hand and giving them, super strength. If they levitate, it must be because the demon is picking them up or something like that. And they give these sort of mechanical explanations. But what was seen in the ancient world is like, actually, I think what's happening here is something more synergistic. And that term itself is related to the energies, right? Synergos is this, it's two energies working in tandem with each other. And so what they saw there is like, it looks like this is actually something where there's some sort of communion happening between the demoniac and the foreign spirit, that somehow the demoniac is actually participating in something that's alien, that there's something of a foreign nature that is somehow taken up residence in it. And they saw that not only because you see like demoniacs who are obviously like possessed and they seem to lose themselves, but they even saw it in the fact that you seem to have synergistic operations, like a fortune teller who seems to have dark knowledge. And she, and I'm using she because I'm thinking of the book of Acts, for example, she is cooperating, right, with the demonic powers. So she finds herself having access to this operative power of the demon, and through that ends up, having access to information that she shouldn't actually have. And so this is where, within this sort of the recognition of the spiritual side of it, was this recognition that it's not just that there's a distinction between a nature and its operative powers, but there's also this sort of receptivity or communicability. And this was part of the fact that they saw us as being in some ways porous, right? They didn't have the mechanical closed view of the universe that started to develop in the Enlightenment. Instead, they had the idea that we are open systems. And you can certainly see this on the biological level, right? Like we recognize the fact that, if we're in a room with toxic air and we breathe it in, it is in some ways harmful to us, right? If we drink things that are poisoned, it is harmful for us. And yet, if we have fresh air, if we have fresh water, if we have food that is good for our body, there's something about it, right, that we take out of it that becomes part of us and can be for our health, right? So there was this recognition that certainly biologically, we are open systems. We are porous. We take in our environment and it can strengthen us or it can make us weak. It can do us good or it can do us harm. And so it is on the spiritual level. They recognize that man is ultimately a spiritual being in a spiritual environment, and we are spiritually open systems. And those open systems open us up to both good and evil things. And so this is one of the reasons why, you see, certainly with regard to the demoniac, this idea that there is a receptivity to dark energies. But there was also on the positive side, they saw with the case of prophets, right, with the case of saints, they saw this idea that what you're seeing is humans who are somehow communing with something that's good, right, something that's powerful, something that heals the sick or raises the dead or whatever it might be. And so it was understood that, just like in your physical environment where there are good and bad things that you take into yourself and can do you good or do you harm, so there is spiritually. And this becomes critical to the New Testament and a lot of what St. Paul has to say about being energized by God for ministry, and ultimately with regard to things like, even the resurrection, right? And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But ultimately, it's also how they saw the communication of the two natures of Christ. So I'd mentioned that Cyril of Alexandria does talk about, the divine attributes being communicated to the humanity of Christ. And I had asked, well, what does that mean, right? If he's not a monophysite, what does that mean? In the context of Cyril, this actually does have to do with the divine energies and the distinction between the essence of God and the energies of God. Now, returning to explain, let's return for a minute to our fire and metal analogy. I had said in the context of that analogy, which again appears in a lot of the Eastern Fathers, it's a favorite. You find it in Gregory of Nyssa, you find it in Basil of Caesarea, you find it in John of Damascus. It's a favorite, right? Maximus the Confessor. And so it's a nice and easy analogy. And one of the things about that analogy that you see is that in the sort of fire and metal analogy, the metal doesn't cease to be metal. And yet, there's something about that nature that makes it receptive to fire, right? Obviously, not everything is receptive to the nature of fire, right? Certain things are combustible, and in this sense, the nature of fire, rather than communing with them, it would actually be destructive to them. But in the case of, iron, for example, this is in some ways a nature that is receptive to those energies. And what the Eastern Fathers see when they talk this way about the divine energies is they recognize that man, being an icon of God, an image of God, has a natural connection to his archetype. And this goes to some basic assumptions about the metaphysics of images and that which they image. That there is a connection between the name of a thing and that which it names. That there's a connection between a symbol and that which it symbolizes. That there is a connection between an image and that which it images. So us being images of God have a natural tether or connection with God. And so much like the way in which iron is naturally, by nature, receptive to the energies of fire. So we, as images of God, are naturally receptive to the energies of God. We have a nature conducive to that sort of thing. We are spiritually open systems. And also in terms of angels, right? If you're thinking, well, what do demons, have to do with this sort of thing? You may be familiar with the language of, the New Testament, which is taken from, prior Jewish traditions already, which is that angels are ministering spirits. And the idea here being that the cosmos itself involves a certain hierarchy. And angels exist for the purpose of being conduits of God to other parts of creation. And we are one of the things they're supposed to minister to. So if you're thinking about it in that way, then it naturally makes sense that we are open systems made to be receptive to the energies of angels. And so that's one of the reasons that receptivity is there, even when the angels go bad and they become demons. And that's one of the reasons why we can find ourselves in communion with them even when they're toxic. It's also one of the reasons why within, Christian tradition and Jewish tradition before this, you see in, like the Maccabean texts, you see that there is also receptivity to the good angels, right? As well. It's not just once they go bad that they, that you become receptive to them. But the idea being that something about the structure of the cosmos itself, the hierarchy of the cosmos itself by design is such that we are open systems that are receptive to the energies of angels, that we are open systems that are receptive to the energies of God. And so with that, what you end up seeing is just like with metal, where it remains metal, but it can commune with or take into itself the energies of fire. So the human being can remain human and take into itself the energies of God. And this becomes an important way of understanding not just things like prophets, right? What's going on with a prophet who seems to be, displaying, miraculous, either knowledge or power or whatever it might be. But it's also an important thing for understanding the Incarnation and ultimately the gospel itself. So let's start with the Incarnation. In the Incarnation, I mentioned that Nestorius had rejected the idea that there was any communication of attributes, right? Again, Nestorius's concern is we've got to avoid these natures mingling, and that's why we have two persons, and those two persons sort of insulate the natures from one another, and then rejected any sort of communication between the two natures. Whereas what Cyril recognizes is that, in fact, the very point of the Incarnation, the very point of the gospel, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, according to the councils themselves, is actually that what has happened in the fall is that humanity, who is made to commune with God and attain eternal life, right? That's what is being depicted in Eden, right? The idea that we have access to the immortal life of God, and yet we turn away from our Creator and we cut ourselves off from that fount of immortality, and we become a dying species. The entire point of the gospel and the Incarnation itself is that he who has life in himself, which is, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, takes on our humanity and rebuilds that bridge between God and man, once again, giving us access to immortality, the immortality we had access to from the start, but which we cut off by distorting our species, walking away from God, and bringing corruption and death upon ourselves. And so the very understanding of the gospel itself is actually exactly that. The idea that what's happening in the Incarnation is the reason you have God taking on humanity is in order to rebuild that bridge. And this is something that in my atonement episode, if you go back and you listen to those two atonement, podcast episodes, I talk about this, right? I talk about the fact that with John Chrysostom, for example, when he's reading St. Paul, and Paul is talking about, that God is the one mediator, or that Christ is the one mediator between God and man, what Chrysostom means by that is not that we are two alienated parties and Christ is stepping in going, whoa, 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 guys. Let's find a compromise here, right? He's not doing something like that. Instead, what's going on is that the mediator language being used here is actually conduit language. It's that we, having turned away from God and crippled ourselves from attaining the type of life and communion with God that we were made to have, Christ rebuilds in his own person by uniting divinity and humanity in his one person, rebuilding that bridge. That's how Chrysostom understands it. It's conduit language, not mediator in a sort of legal sense sort of language. And so when they talk about like God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, that sort of language that you find in the New Testament, that reconciliation is not legal reconciliation. It's ontological, right? It's the idea that somehow we've been cut off. We've cut ourselves off from God and put ourselves in this sort of crippled, dying position. And what Christ is doing in the Incarnation is rebuilding that. Now, when you look at it in that way, all of a sudden it makes sense. Well, of course, there has to be some sort of communication of divine attributes between, divinity and humanity, because that's the entire point. But here, attribute doesn't mean changing human nature such that, the way you would in a sort of, a centaur scenario where you're getting rid of certain attributes. Instead, what's going on here is that humanity is made as an image of God to commune with God, to partake of the divine nature, and to become more than it is in and of itself. So we are naturally made to be in a synergistic relationship. We are made to be, let's use our fire and metal. We're made metal, but we're metal made to commune with fire. And here, of course, God would be fire. And so the idea is that, and this is what's typically referred to as deification in the Eastern Fathers, that we are sort of made to become like God, or made to become God is some of the language that they sometimes use, in the sense that the divine attributes somehow become part of us. We take them into ourselves. We are metamorphosized. We are transfigured, right, by that communion. And so with the Eastern Fathers, what they see is they see that humanity is essentially made to be in that sort of communal relationship with God. And really, there's a sense in which you don't really see what humanity is made to be until you see the resurrected Christ. Because only there, in the resurrected Christ, do you actually begin to see what a deified human looks like. Somebody who actually has successfully attained incorruption and immortality, someone who has been transfigured by communion with the divine nature. And that right there is the picture, right? The resurrected Christ is the picture of what man is made to be, but never became in Eden. And that is the thing that we are made to become ultimately. Now, once you see that, of course, now what you see is, of course, the Incarnation has to involve some sort of communion with the divine nature, some sort of communication of attributes, by which they mean the divine energies, to humanity, because that's the whole point, right? Like, what is happening in the Incarnation? Well, unless, if you're with the Eastern Fathers and you don't have this sort of penal substitution judicial view, but instead you have an ontological view that says that the entire point of the Incarnation is to reunite divinity and humanity, to reconcile those two things ontologically in the person of Christ, so that humanity can be elevated and transfigured into what it's made to be. And then that mediator is the one that we can enter into communion with, and through that be elevated as well. Then of course there has to be a communication of divine energies to humanity. That's the very point. And so what the Lutherans are rightly seeing is they're rightly seeing that Cyril is talking about this very point, that there has to be some sort of communication of divine energies from Christ's divine nature to the human nature that he takes on. And of course, Cyril is saying that because it's that communication that is healing humanity and elevating humanity and transfiguring humanity and making us what we're made to become, right? Of course, that's what's happening. But the Lutherans, not having the essence energies distinction, don't really have a concept of energies. They only have this concept of attributes in the sort of classic, sort of Western Latin sense. And this is the thing that alarms the Reformed, right? This is why their version of talking about, a communication of attributes begins to sound like monophysite. Like what they're saying is somehow there must be some sort of trading out or, sort of unifying of essential traits over here or something like that, because they don't have an energies distinction. Whereas, of course, Cyril of Alexandria does. Hi, I'm Dr. Nathan Jacobs, scholar in residence at Vanderbilt and host of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, and I'm inviting you to join my Introduction to Philosophy class starting August 7th, with lectures every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central. You get 22 hours of live, interactive lectures with me over the course of 13 weeks as we survey the history of ideas from ancient to modern philosophy. Can't make it live? No problem. It's all recorded, and everyone registered for the class will have access to those recordings. You can audit the class and simply enjoy the lectures and interactions, or take it for credit. Transcripts will be available showing the class is accredited should you want to transfer to a college of your choosing. Register by August 4th. To sign up, visit myproffer.com today. See description for details. And a quick note about Proffer. Higher education is broken, and Proffer is working hard to fix it. You'll be hearing a lot about this company in the coming years. It's a tech startup aimed at revolutionizing higher ed through decentralized, independent learning. Why do I trust them? Because I'm the CEO. Our mission is to make accredited college courses available from the best educators in the world at a fraction of the cost, with maximal flexibility for both educators and students. Our website may look a little rough around the edges during this beta phase, but the education is world-class. We're bringing in professors from Notre Dame, Stanford, Northern Arizona University, and more just for our beta test. Their courses go live in the coming weeks, but don't be surprised if, at the moment, you see only me and my course on the site. So be amongst the first to join the revolution in higher ed by going to myproffer.com and signing up for my class today. Now, back to the show. Okay, I think that's a good spot to pause, and we will continue next week with part 2 of this episode on the Eucharist. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.